about 5 seconds from now.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session. What can we learn about leadership from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, more commonly known as NASA? This session was originally organised at the request of our Scottish Clinical Leadership Fellows, who asked for an opportunity to learn from senior leaders across Scotland and internationally about their personal leadership stories in order to identify the key attributes which make a good leader. Given the challenges faced by our health and social care colleagues over the last year and a half, we decided that this session would be an opportunity to give something positive back to our colleagues who have worked tirelessly to provide high quality, world-class care to the people of Scotland. I am absolutely delighted that we have over 930 colleagues registered for today's event, and I hope that you're all set to have some fun and be inspired. I'm now going to hand over to Jennifer, who take you through some quick housekeeping pointers. Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks, Gregor, and welcome everyone to the Realistic Medicine Studio. I hope you're all as excited as we are today. So I just have a couple of quick housekeeping slides to get started. So you'll see these points on the screen here. You'll not be able to use your microphone or camera in a live event, but you will be, of course, able to see and hear the presenters. It's not possible to interact with the other attendees through the chat, but you can upvote by liking any submitted questions you'd particularly like to see put to the speaker, and I'll come on to that in a little minute. If you could please use the Q&A function to submit your questions to the speaker. These will be moderated, so it may take a minute or two for your question to show up in the live chat. And just to flag, the session is going to be recorded, and we'll be sending out a link afterwards, together with any links to resources mentioned by our speakers today, a short evaluation survey, and of course, a much coveted Realistic Medicine session certificate. So on your screen, you can see the Q&A function on the top right. It's circled here in red. It's right next to the leave button, which is not ideal, so do be careful. It's definitely a good example of a human factors risk right there. But if you do, by mistake, leave the session, just click back on your login link and it will bring you straight back in. So all questions submitted will show up in your My Questions tab, and once approved by our session moderator, will then show up in the Feature tab. If you are having any technical issues, you can also submit these through the Q&A function, and David, our expert technical lead for today, will be able to respond to you directly. And finally, if you see a question someone else has posted that you would like to see put to our speakers today, then please just click on the like button and give it a thumbs up, and that will bring it to our attention. And just to say, please do stay part of the conversation. Mary from our team is on track with some live tweeting throughout today's session, so we'll be sharing resources and tweets, so please do go over there and check that out. So I'm now going to just pass you back to Gregor, who's going to introduce the first of our exciting speakers for today. Gregor, over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. So, if you'll excuse the rocket analogy that I'm about to use, today's session will come in 2 stages. I'm delighted to have not one but 2 amazing speakers who will be sharing their personal leadership stories of what they've learned along the way. Both of them have given the time very generously to NHS Scotland even before today, and though today they're joining us virtually, both personally and professionally, I look forward to being able to welcome them back to these shores again in the future, hopefully in the not too distant future. Following both presentations, we'll have some time for some questions and answers, so please think about your questions and get them ready. I'm going to change things round a little bit slightly from the published order because JD's just keeping a little close eye on some operations that are going on at this moment in time. So the first of our speakers today is Dr. Nigel Packham. Now, Nigel is the Associate Director of Safety and Mission Assurance at NASA headquarters based in Houston, Texas. He was born in London and now living in Houston, Texas. Nigel's no stranger to the world of healthcare. Both his parents were clinicians, his father a urologist and his mother an ophthalmologist. His brother a recently retired general physician. Nigel himself works at NASA Johnson Space Centre as lead for flight safety and managed the review which led to the public release of the Columbia Crew Survival Investigation Report in 2008. Whilst working in NASA's Engineering Directorate, Nigel also served as the commander of a 4-person crew that spent 91 days inside a 6-metre diameter chamber to demonstrate capabilities of advanced systems for air, water and waste recovery for long duration missions. That's definitely commitment to the cause, I'm sure you'll agree. Welcome, Nigel, and on a personal note, it's really good to see you again.
Gregor, good afternoon to all of you. It's our pleasure to be here today. And well, Gregor didn't mention JD is actually monitoring the docking and hard docking of a very large module that's coming up to the Russian side of the International Space Station this morning. And there were some issues that we just had to keep an eye on. So JD is just keeping as will be with his bedside manner, just keeping an eye on the patient. So we just switched up a little bit, and so I'll be going first. Thank you so much for the introduction, Gregor. It will be wonderful to see you again in person, as it will all of our friends in Scotland and the UK and the Republic of Ireland. First and foremost, I should say that this has been a difficult year and a half for everybody, but certainly we send our best wishes from the agency to everyone there, every health professional that takes care of patients in Scotland, Ireland, England, anywhere that we send our best wishes to you. I know this latest surge that has particularly hit Northern Ireland pretty badly, I believe. We thought we'd turn the corner and we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but we have one more challenge to overcome, and then we'll be back to a point where we'll be able to enjoy without this even 6,000 miles of social distance. So I thought what I'd do today is take you through a few points, hopefully some food for thought for you. So Jennifer, we can go to the first slide. And I would say that you wouldn't probably expect to see a family tree as the first slide in a presentation from NASA, but as Gregor said, I thought I'd show you this just to show you my humble beginnings. You'll notice I'm down here in the bottom right. You'll also notice that my second middle name, Charles, is crossed out. And that is because when I became a US citizen, there is no space for a third name. So I actually had to give up one of my God-given rights when I was born and gave up Charles. Next chart. And as Gregor said, my father was a urologist, my mother was an ophthalmologist, and my brother Bruce, who still lives in the UK, he lives in Warrington. He's now a retired GP. So if you go to the next chart, Jennifer, you might really be asking, so what the heck happened to me? Well, honestly, I was much more of an athlete than I was an academic. So playing rugby, cricket, and hockey. I played rugby for Surrey long time ago, but that was great times. So when I finished my high school and didn't get into medical school, next chart, Jennifer. I proudly announced to my father that I was going to go become a sheep farmer in Australia, at which point he said, I don't think so. So next chart. So he convinced me to go to the university, and I actually went to the City of London Polytechnic, which is now the Guildhall University, to take up geology. I hated geology. I couldn't deal with crystallography. So next chart, Jennifer. So I ended up sort of getting back into where my father, I think, hoped I would get to, which is becoming a chemist. So I actually became a biologist and chemist. Went through Guildhall, got my bachelor's there in about 1981. Did some postgraduate work at Imperial College in astrophysics, and then went from the middle of London, where Imperial College is, to the middle of nowhere, which is the middle of Texas. Texas A&M University is in College Station, Texas, and if you look on a map of Texas, it's dead in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of equidistant in a triangle between Dallas, Houston, and Austin, but 60,000 students call it home. So, so that's my humble beginning. So next chart. A couple of things that actually Gerga mentioned that I'm proud of in my past is back in 1995, I was asked to be the single crew member in a test that looked at how 22,000 wheat plants could keep an individual alive without any additional oxygen needed from the outside. So 22,000 wheat plants provided all of my oxygen, took up all of my carbon dioxide throughout the 15-day test. Proving that yes, in fact, the world actually does work, and that green plants and flora actually give up oxygen and take up CO2. But in a very closed environment, things happen very quickly. Next chart. And here is that test that the Gregor actually was specific about. This is a 6-meter diameter chamber in one of the buildings at the Johnson Space Center, not far from Mission Control. This was a 91-day test with 4 crew. And its aim was really to demonstrate long-duration life support capabilities. But we also did a lot of testing on human physiology and human psychology, some of which I'm very pleased to note. Some of those experiments actually may have made their way to the International Space Station for long-duration flights. The reason I show this photograph is it takes a team, right, to actually get this test completed. So although the focus might have been on the 4 people stuck inside this chamber for 3 months, the people that were actually responsible for the test were the ones in the control room taking care. It was a mini mission control, if you want to call it that. But they were actually keeping an eye on us as we went around our daily business, doing life support systems maintenance and all those experiments that I talked about. Next chart. So I thought I'd take you through a few leadership challenges that I faced in my career and how I've actually met the challenges, if you want to call it that. So one of the things that is necessary in space, obviously, is water. And water is very heavy; it's non-compressible. But the space shuttle did a wonderful thing when it was designed. It used fuel cells to generate electricity, and as a byproduct of that electricity generation, water is actually formed. And so for visits to the International Space Station, and originally from the Shuttle Mir program, our visits to the Mir space station, the Russians owned, we actually were able to bag this water up. And what you see here is an astronaut. Actually, he's a very good friend of mine, Terry Wilcott. He actually bagged this water up inside these containers and transferred them across from the shuttle to the space station. I think this was actually a Mir flight, so it actually was transferred to the Russian space station. So the trouble is, this was new, right? So we really didn't have a way to do this originally. So the challenge first was to design, build, and test, and then certify this water transfer hardware. We have to also keep track of every single liter of water and wastewater on board these space stations. So we know exactly how much water is in each of those bags when they're transferred, but we can keep track of how they're actually used. Now, since this was a visit to the Mir space station, and the fact that our Russian colleagues and our Japanese and European and Canadian colleagues are part of the International Space Station, there's always a negotiation with these international partners. And if you've ever had to negotiate with the Russians, you will find that they are very they're hard taskmasters. They're not a pushover by any means at all. But I will tell you that the space environment is much, much more congenial than the politicians on the ground would actually portray. It is one environment. It doesn't matter if you're American, Russian, Canadian, European, or American. We're all in the same environment. They're all in it together. And so our job is to really support them throughout their stays on these long duration flights. The negotiations took a turn for the more difficult after the Columbia accident back in 2003, because now the Russians were the only way to get people to the space station and to get samples returned. They were the only game in town, and they knew it. So the negotiations took on a much more critical manner. And so in the year following Columbia, I was actually in Moscow 5 times, negotiating with my colleagues and the Europeans and the Canadians and so on, to not just make sure that we had sufficient water, but also to make sure that the environment on board the space station was still okay for keeping people there. We also supported, obviously, real-time water operations when the shuttle was there, so we kept an eye on how much water was going across. And of course, we had to respond to off-nominal situations. And in some cases, these bags leaked, which is not to be unexpected. They are plastic bags on the inside, well, very highly specialized plastic bags on the inside. So we had to actually respond real time to things that were happening perhaps at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning on board these space stations. So these were some of the leadership challenges that really we had to rely on what we had learned, right? And from the leadership perspective, I was really in the beginnings really of my first leadership challenge. So next chart. Talking about Columbia, when Columbia disintegrated over the skies of Texas on February the 1st, 2003, and losing all of the 7 crew members who were also very good friends of mine, I took the task on of leading a very small, I would say less than 10 people, highly motivated team though, to discover what happened to the crew and the crew module as it disintegrated over the skies of Texas on that fateful day, which was a beautiful Saturday morning. One of the leadership challenges, one of the main ones, was we had factions within the agency that did not want any report of what we found out in terms of what happened to the crew and the crew module published. They did not want it. They did not want it out there for the world to see. I was damned and determined that this was going to get out there so that other spacefaring nations could learn the hard lessons that we had learned from Columbia. So in the course of that, I also had to play a role as a support role, supporting the crew families, of course, while explaining what had happened to their loved ones and my friends, as I said. But it was important enough that the lessons we learned there were vital to get out to the general public. And in fact, on New Year's Eve, 2008, that's exactly. But after that, it was then a case of going around the world, really telling the story of what had happened. And I think the last count, I've reached maybe 80,000 people worldwide. And the next chart, which is the final leadership challenge I'm going to talk about today, which is called about dissenting opinions. Now, I was asked to look at the dissenting opinion process, which is one that ensures that all viewpoints are heard, right? Let me say first off that dissenting opinion processes do not work well in an operations environment. So the docking we had this morning, it's way too late for somebody to say, well, I don't think this is the right thing to do right now when a vehicle is closing in on the space station at, at a meter per second. So this is much more used in the design phase or in the planning phase. But anyone in the team, on the program team, can appeal a decision that's being made by a higher up, a program manager, all the way up to the administrator's level. But that process was very poorly understood not just by the people that wanted to make a dissent, but also the program managers and the dissenters. That no one really understood the right way to do it. So what that ended up happening was that it ended up being a very lengthy appeal process, and JD will probably, he will acknowledge this, that some of these appeals actually took from months to years to come to resolution, if they ever did. So my task here was to generate a new process, which in part allowed dissents to be resolved, sometimes perhaps within weeks to months, rather than months to years. And part of the leadership challenges that we face are also to make sure that the people understand these processes, and the way we do that is by mentoring people, especially people that had a desire to dissent against an opinion. So I can't tell you how many people have come to me and said, please walk me through this process so that I can understand it, and where I have to be to actually uphold that dissent. But I will tell you, it's not an easy thing to go through, is raising a dissent, but it's vital to having an open discussion, right? Which will get all of those points of view heard. And the last chart I have, and hopefully I'm just almost out of time, but I just wanted to share with you some of the golden rules I have, and the first 5 of these are really about leadership. Generating a safe and secure environment for your team. I'm not talking perhaps about physical security, but one in which people feel that they can raise their opinions. Your team will trust you after that, and that is the second one here. So you have to trust your people to know what they're talking about, know what they're doing, and in turn, if you generate that safe and secure environment, they will exhibit trust towards you. The third one here, though, I think is probably the most important one I've learned over my time at NASA, which is to look for the hidden voices. And that may be a little bit of a mixed metaphor, but I truly mean that. We had a program manager in the space station world called Bill Gerstenmaier, who was absolutely the best person that could actually put this in practice. When he was chairing the flight readiness reviews, which is in our situation is the last review before we actually commit people to go fly. If he asked a question, he rarely looked or listened to the person that was answering the question. He more looked around the room, which may have had 200 people in it, and looked to see facial expressions or even the way people are acting. And he would find the people that he knew wanted to say something, but were probably a little either too shy, too inhibited to actually say something. And he would ask them, "Are you okay with this decision?" And I've learned that from Bill. And even in today's environment, this virtual environment, when I'm in a Teams meeting and there may be 30 people on the participant list, I keep the participant list open, and I keep a mental note of who has actually been talking and who hasn't seemed to have said much. And I go out and call specifically on those people that really haven't said much. These are probably very, very simple golden rules, but be supportive, modest, praise in public, correct in private, never do that in public. And always, if somebody asks, offer your experiences to those that ask for. This is what we're doing here, but that really goes to the mentoring aspect of my job. For my personal side of things, I always allow myself to fail, but learn from the failures. And I've had failures and I've learned from them, and I've come out the other side doing fine. Build a large network. This is an example of just that, right? And I'm not talking about your Facebook or Twitter. I'm talking about real people, right? So you can pick up a phone, that thing that used to have an actual wire attached to it, but pick up the phone and talk to people and find out. If you don't know the answer to a question, I know who to call to actually get that answer. I'm going to suggest that to avoid becoming a generalist, be very good at a few things. And if an opportunity finds you, and I will tell you, the Columbia Crew Survival investigation found me, and I was happy to seize it. And this is probably the most difficult one to actually implement, but is one that I practice quite a bit. But don't be afraid to go out on the limb. Sometimes that limb takes you to another ladder, another way to get up in the world, or another direction that you may never have thought was in your game plan. So with that, I think I've used my time up, and I'd like to turn it back over to Jennifer or to Gregor to introduce JP.
Nigel, Thank you. There'll be time to pick up some questions after the next presenter, but I'm so taken by what you've had to say there. Again, I've heard you say some of it before, but I think those golden rules that you gave us at the end is something that we would want to maybe try to return to in the questions that people are forming. So thank you for that just now. Next up in our exciting session today is yet another inspirational leader. Dr. J.D. Polk has been the Chief Health and Medical Officer at NASA, based in their Washington, D.C. headquarters since 2016. J.D. is an emergency medicine physician qualified in managerial studies and aerospace medicine. How cool is that? He is well published in the fields of emergency medicine, disaster medicine, space medicine, and medical management. He's received numerous awards and commendations, including citations from, get this, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the White House Medical Unit, Association of Air Medical Services, the US Air Force, and has received the NASA Center Director's Commendation, the NASA Exceptional Service Medal, the National Security and International Affairs Medal, and the NASA Exceptional Achievement Medal. But don't let the accent fool you. Whilst JD's joining us from the States, he is actually Scottish, or at least I'm claiming him. His grandparents came from Renfrewshire, and he enjoys nothing more than visiting their old haunts in Paisley, or taking a trip up north to Skye to take in the scenery there and enjoy some much needed relaxation time with his family. It's a huge pleasure to welcome back JD, and JD, I cannot wait to see you in person when you finally make it back over again.
Gregor, you as well. Thanks for having us, and I really wish I was there in person for sure. This is, I'm sure for you as well, it's been a very long pandemic, and you know, I apologize for the switch up in the roster, and thanks for Nigel for his willingness to go first. We were docking the Russian MLM module to the ISS, and probably driving Jennifer crazy, because we actually put the video up, and we're closing at, you got to remember, these two vehicles are moving at 28,000 kilometers per hour, and closing at a range very quickly to dock. And so it's a little bit of a nail biter to watch that happening over the planet, and monitoring that to make sure everything goes well. But really appreciate it. And you know, Nigel did a great job talking about how we look at the processes and how we look at things in leadership at NASA. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on maybe the medical aspect, or deep in on how we look at it from the medical leadership. And so, Jennifer, next slide, if I could, please. Just to give you a little background, in addition to you know, the Russian module that just docked, we tomorrow, hopefully at 3 o'clock our time, Eastern time, we will launch the Boeing rocket with the Boeing capsule, what's called the OFT-2 capsule. This one does not have crew on board. It's a test flight before we put the crew on board that capsule. And so we've got a lot of things going on. Most of you probably saw that Virgin Galactic launched, and of course Blue Origin launched, and all of these different vehicles going on. It's a busy time to be in space flight. Next, please. And, you know, as Nigel alluded to, it's a great international partnership that we have, and it's 20 years and counting. And again, 250 nautical miles above the Earth for us, and miles per hour versus kilometers, 17,500 miles per hour in 26 countries. And it's a massive lab where we do a lot of medical research as well. The drug Keytruda that many of you may know for stage 4 lung cancer, that has changed the survival rate for stage 4 lung cancer, was researched on the International Space Station. And the Space Station has an advantage in that you can look at things in 3 dimensions. They appear more 3-dimensional in space. We can do different crystals that you can't form on the ground. We can do different proteins that you can't form on the ground. It's really been a boon, and especially on pharmacologic research and crystalline structure. Next slide, please. And the other thing that we're working on down here, which is in the vehicle assembly building, I showed Jennifer this the other day when we did a test call, this massive building that we call the vehicle assembly building. Inside that is this rocket right now being finally assembled, and the Orion capsule, which is our large capsule that the astronauts will be in, and then the what we call the SLS, or the Space Launch System, that has the 2 booster rockets, and this massive rocket that's even more powerful than the Saturn V that we had back in Apollo. And this is to take us back to the moon. And it's amazing to actually see that vehicle in the VAB right now, being in final assembly, getting the capsule added to it here in the next couple of weeks to months. So, and ready to do its test flight around the moon. That's going to be really, awesome to see. And I tell you what, when this rocket goes up, it vibrates every cell in your body. It's an amazing thing to be in the Launch Control Center. Next slide, please. And just to give you an idea of the other things that we're working on as far as leadership and why a lot of leadership is needed, especially when you're going to other planets. This is the Gateway system, and this is different than how we did Apollo. This looks almost like a miniature space station, except that it actually has thrusters and can fly around like a vehicle, but it has the Orion capsule that you see down on the right, that's about to dock to the Gateway, and the lander that's up top. And this is a little bit larger lander than most of us are used to when we look at the Apollo photographs. Next slide, please. And this is about what that will look like. It's a pretty large lander, and the idea for that Gateway is it'll go around the moon in different orbits that allow us to, the astronauts, to go back and forth to survey different areas of the moon, to look at, for example, in the southern hemisphere, close to the poles, to look for water ice that's actually hidden in the recesses of the craters and the shadows of the crater. And so that's going to be some very interesting experiments and looking at the rest of the moon and its geography and whether or not there's trapped water ice in those different craters. Next slide, please. And the other part that really requires a lot of leadership on our half is taking care of the astronauts. And probably one of the biggest pertinent negatives that we have is, to date, after 60 years and plus of spaceflight, 65 years really, we've not had to return to Earth for a medical reason, including for the 20 years of the International Space Station, with crews staying up there 6 months and a year at a time. We've not had to make an emergency return for any medical reason. And that's not by coincidence. We've actually done a lot of work to mitigate that risk. And the astronauts have a lot of physiologic changes. They've got intracranial pressure that occurs from that fluid shift that goes, imagine all that blood in your lower extremities moving up into your thorax, into your head. They have a risk for kidney stones. They have a risk for bone loss from the offloading of those bones. They have actually a physiologic change in the musculature, especially in the lower extremity, going from slow twitch to fast twitch fibers. There's a lot of things that occur. And with those changes come a lot of things that we have to mitigate to make sure that they stay healthy. And that takes a great deal of leadership on figuring out how we're going to mitigate those things. Next slide, please. And we break these down into compartments on it starts with standards, and where we write standards, think of them more like being biblical. Those are things that we want people to follow and make sure that they do. It's not something that we waive very often. And then we've got risks that we try to mitigate. We look at research for evidence and looking at all of those hazards. And so those are things that we try to take care of and work out for all of these different spaceflight missions. Next slide, please. NASA does risk, or how we talk about risk, in actually 5x5 charts, frequency versus severity. What's the likelihood or frequency that something is going to occur, and how severe is it going to be if it does occur? So, and the further up that you get on that risk list, if you get into that red territory, we either need something to be highly reliable, or we have to have what we call fault tolerance. So to put that in medical terms, imagine if you're intubating somebody and you can't get the airway. Well, that occurs. occurs. It doesn't ever not occur. So the frequency that you could have a difficult airway, let's say for the sake of argument that that's 3 on the frequency or likelihood, and then the severity, of course, of not getting that airway would be 5. So that would be a 3 by 5 risk. And then because that's in the red territory, you always would have backup systems. You'd have another way to get that airway if you couldn't get it through intubation. And of course, if you couldn't get it with something else, then you could always do cricothyrotomy. So that's what we would call 2 fault tolerant, meaning that if something failed, that you have a backup plan, and if that fails, you have another backup plan. And spacecraft systems usually are 2 fault tolerant and highly reliable. Next slide, please. And if you think about it, in the commercial sector, we do the same thing. Think about the airline that you're on. If the landing gear doesn't go down, the pilot doesn't come on and say, well, it's a bad day to fly today. Sorry, folks. You have a secondary system. They have a backup hydraulic system. And if that fails, they can still go below and crank that gear down by hand if they have to. And so, that's a very severe thing if the landing gear doesn't go down with a passenger plane with 400 people aboard. So they have the same thing. They have 2 fault tolerant systems on things that are very critical. And we can apply that to medicine as well. Think of all the different things that you do with your patients, or in the ICU, or in the emergency department, or in your case, the A&E department. And all the things where we can have 2 fault tolerance on high-risk items to make sure we take care of the patient. Next slide, please. We also do what's called an integrated medical model. A lot of folks say, how do you figure out what you're going to take with you? How do you know what you're going to take with you to Mars? And we do a big computer analysis called a Monte Carlo analysis, where the computer program will do millions of runs simulating a mission to see what might happen. And we put data from the submarine data from the Navy in there, everything that they've ever treated or ever had to surface or ever had to evacuate from a submarine. We put our spaceflight data in there. We put analog data from the Arctic and Antarctic missions from the polar stations and everything that they've had that have come up. And we see what spits out from a likelihood standpoint. Next slide. And this gives you an idea on those conditions, how accurate we are. And this is looking at about close to 40 missions in the ISS. It's actually Expedition 14 through 40, but we've added several since then. And you can see there were 15 conditions that we were really spot on. We were right on the nose on predicting what's the likelihood of those events, and that's pretty amazing in and of itself. And then on the other side, you can see there are 17 conditions we over-predicted. That's because the astronauts are typically a little healthier than the average population and the populations that we put in that Monte Carlo analysis. And there were a few 7 conditions that we under-predicted. And so we do that analysis to try to predict, what do we need to take with us? What's the likelihood that some event is going to occur, whether it's a kidney stone or a dental abscess or acute sinusitis, all of those diagnoses that might occur, and then make sure that we've got the appropriate medications and equipment to treat all of those things. Next slide, please. And we put those, this is what we call a design reference mission, or a DRM. We figure out, the further you get away from Mother Earth, the higher the risk is. And so you can see that the red over there, those are all for the Mars missions right now, or planetary missions, where you're going to be away from Mother Earth for 3 years. It'll take 6 months to get there. And remember that the Mars and Earth don't line up again for 18 months, and then 6 months to get back. You're literally there almost 3 years on that mission. And so can you imagine trying to figure out and forecast and take with you all the things that you might need for a medical mission? And you've got to be mindful of things like weight. You can't just take a large CAT scan or MRI with you. There's a lot of things that we have to think about when we go into those space missions. Next. Thanks, Jennifer. And how do we do preventive medicine for the astronauts? We do a lot of clinical practice guidelines, but we also do a lot of quality metrics. And this gives you an idea of how we look at the astronauts. There might be 45 active astronauts at any one time. And with our clinical practice guidelines, we can figure out exactly where each individual astronaut falls. And so that helps me as the chief medical officer. When I get this graph, I can look and say, hey, why is astronaut 10 have cholesterol that's 240? How come we haven't managed that below 200 and certainly below 160 if at all possible? And it allows us to call those things out when we see them and figure out why is that person leaving the herd, if you will, from the clinical practice guideline, and how do we manage that risk? Now, if you look at that bottom graph, I bet you can tell. Notice that's a timeline in years, and you notice that the C-reactive protein timeline for an astronaut, that there was a steep drop off all of a sudden where this occurred. And I bet most of you can guess what that was. And that's actually when statins came into vogue, and we began prescribing statins for cholesterol and to decrease the C-reactive protein and inflammation in the arteries. And you can see where the massive drop off in the C-reactive protein is. Next slide, please. And we use those clinical practice guidelines to make sure that, at least in critical areas, that all the physicians are practicing very much the same. And a good example of that is bone physiology. We may prescribe bisphosphonates and a particular resistive exercise program for the astronauts to maintain their femur strength and their bone strength. Next slide, please. So, on the leadership aspects, how do we do all of this? When we have all of these flight surgeons, all these biomedical engineers, how do we get all of this mechanization of clinical practice guidelines and 5x5 risks and everything moving in the same direction? Well, much like Nigel talked about, a lot of what we do is empower people to do their jobs. We're not big on micromanagement. We hire the right people, and I'll tell you, we hire first and foremost for what we call EQ, or emotional intelligence. I can teach people certain aspects of spaceflight physiology. I can teach them certain things on their roles, but hiring them for that emotional intelligence is paramount. And then empowering them to do that job, and then listening for alternate opinions, like Nigel mentioned, and being open to alternate opinions so that we don't get groupthink. Having a team mentality, and this is for every job, and making sure everyone knows that they are important. And there's a long story about a individual where there was a reporter that was interviewing people in the Apollo era, and asked a gentleman what he did there at NASA, and the gentleman said, well, I helped put people on the moon. And then about an hour later, he saw that gentleman emptying trash cans, and he thought, why does the janitor think he helps put people on the moon? And the flight director, without missing a beat, said, because he does, because everybody has a role to play to put people on the moon. If Harry doesn't do his job, then mission control is a mess. And if mission control is a mess, then we can't do our job. And if we can't do our job, the astronauts can't do their job. So Harry does help put people on the moon. And that mentality, I think, is important in medicine too, that everybody up and down the chain taking care of that patient has a role to play. And they need to feel like they're respected for those roles. Kaizen as well, always constantly improving our systems, never being satisfied. That applies to hardware as well as to people. We've got fitness centers at every NASA center. We have wellness programs at every NASA center. We're trying to improve our folks not only on their technical side, but improve them on their physical and emotional side as well. One of the things that's been difficult in this pandemic is, as most of you know, it's a little easier to be rude to people on a distance, or on Zoom or on Teams, when you're doing remote versus in person. And the people get stressed with this pandemic. So we've had what we call C+10, or congeniality +10, meaning strive to be about 10% more congenial than you would normally be due to this distance communication, stress, and non-contact. The other thing that we do going into missions, which is a small thing that I keep in the back of my mind in leadership, is what we call PEPC, which is people, equipment, procedures, and communication. Do I have the right people to do this job or this mission? Do I have the right equipment? Do I have the right procedures in place? And do we have the right communication to make sure everybody understands how this mission is going to go? And then prepare for and know exactly how you're going to handle what we call black swans. If you've ever seen Nassim Taleb's book, to make sure that we know and can prepare for the bad days like Columbia or Challenger, and know exactly how we're going to execute when things don't go to plan. And the biggest thing I can tell you, at least from all of my years in leadership, and especially at NASA, is to be flexible, and that relationships matter. It's really helpful to be able to pick up the phone and call someone and say, hey Steve, what do you think about this? Or hey Janet, what do you think about this? And folks appreciate that as well. Next slide. That's the end, and I think we've got lots of questions filling up on the question and answer. So Jennifer, I'll wait and see if you or Gregor are going to lead us through that, and Nigel and I will be happy to answer them.
So I'm going to lead the questions, Gregor. I wonder if you want to come in just for a moment.
No, I think, Jennifer, I mean, those were two wonderful presentations, and as I say, we'll no doubt pick up a lot of the points that were made in them in the course of the questions. I'm especially struck by actually just how much of the overlap there was between the two presentations. There's two things that really stick out for me, and it's about looking for the hidden voices and listening, especially to those alternate opinions you said between you. And I think there's never been a more important time to be working in that way, to be using networks, because all of us need to be able to kind of seek advice from time to time. And over the last 16 months, it's something which has been incredibly important for me with the networks that I have, both here within the UK, but also internationally as well. We should never be afraid to develop those networks so that we can use them in that way to further our own understanding as well. Jennifer, I'm going to hand it over to you just now so that we get a chance to kind of properly look at these questions that you've got.
Thanks, Gregor, and boy do we have questions. So there's so many questions that were coming in there. I think it was quite slow at the start, I think, as people were listening intently to you, but the first question that I'm going to ask seems very apt for the pre-call that we had when there was so much happening. The question's from Claire Black, and she asks, both Nigel and JD appear very calm, and I can't begin to imagine the pressure of trying to dock a space station. So how do you stay calm under pressure?
I'll let JD take that one.
Yeah, yeah, Nigel knows this firsthand too. You have kind of a mentality that you go into, and I'm sure that's true for all clinicians when you're in the heat of battle of whether it's the doing an emergency patient or in surgery, et cetera. You kind of go into this quote unquote the zone where you're focused on what's going on. What we're looking for. Nigel and I were talking back and forth on the rate of closure of the spacecraft, looking at the targets, looking at all the things. No, you kind of have an idea because we've practiced and we've simulated hundreds of times how things go. And so you also, by simulating things hundreds of times, and we've simulated bad cases and good cases, you tend to know and can tell almost immediately when it's not going to plan, when you can tell when it's awry. And so part of the reason we're calm right now is because it was going to plan. And but we've practiced that, and I think that's one of the benefits of simulations that we've done is there's no catastrophe that we have not practiced at least 20 or 30 times at NASA, and that helps you, instead of having chaos of trying to figure out what to do next. It's what to do next is almost a pre-planned decision, and you've been and seen that before, and so that helps give you a little bit of calm or peace, if you will, about what to do, but also gives you clear and concise leadership guidelines for how to handle something. And Nigel, what are your thoughts?
Well, the great thing about teams, of course, is you can't see what's happening below shuttle level. So So we're like the proverbial ducks paddling like hell underneath the water. So, but no, JD hit it right on the nose. I think we simulate so many things and so many times, right? And most of the time, the teams don't know what's about to be simulated. That's one thing. We have a person that we all like to hate called the Simulation Supervisor. We call him the Sim Soup. That collects scenarios that the actual simulation team has no idea what they're going to get thrown at them. So, yeah, I will tell you though that there are times when you cannot prepare. Right? We did not prepare for a Columbia breaking up over the skies of Texas on that fateful day, but we learned from it, right? And that's what you do all the time. Is if you have something that was unexpected, you say, well, that was interesting, but you don't just say, okay, done, it's in the past. You say, okay, so how did it happen? How can we learn from it? And how can we either prevent it from happening, or at least from next time it comes around, you know what's happening, right? So I think that's all about learning from failures too. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks so much, both. You certainly kept me calm when my MS Teams didn't work at the start of the session, which compared to a shuttle landing, I think gives me some perspective. The next question is actually from Craig Bell, who's our policy lead for realistic medicine in the Scottish Government. And this is a question for Nigel. And Craig asks, Nigel, 91 days in an isolation chamber sounds a bit like lockdown max. What were the impacts on your mental health and how did you cope?
Well, I joked that I was 6'4" when I went in, and I'm only 5'7" now. But that's a physiological response. I'm joking, by the way. From the psychological perspective, it was very easy, honestly, because we had spent a lot of time, and JD will tell you about this for flight crews. They spend, certainly for shuttle flight crews, they spend at least a couple of years together. Their offices were in the same major part of the building, right? So they trained as a crew. They lived as a crew. Their families knew each other, and we went through the same type of preparation for that chamber test. But I will tell you, right about 2 weeks before the test, one person was ruled out medically, right, because of a heart condition. So we then had to switch everybody around. So one function, I was the life support systems specialist. I became the commander. So we now had to shift. So that was a psychological challenge, obviously. But once we got inside the chamber, it was all hands on deck, and we knew exactly what we had to do. We did actually monitor our psychological health. We had a psychologist and psychiatrist on staff, and if we needed to talk to anyone about stresses that was always there, I can tell you that. We had that opportunity to do so. But we also had computer systems that are currently in use on board the space station today that allows us allows the ground crew to actually remotely monitor physiological and psychological health. So and JD will also probably tell you that for flight crews, they have an opportunity for a private medical conference, at least, well, for the expeditions, I don't know how often, what the frequency is now, JD, but I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah, we still do them weekly, and of course they have what's called the Internet Protocol phone they can use through satellites to talk to the surgeon in between times, or to talk to the psychiatrist or psychologist in between times, and also to their family when necessary.
Brilliant, you're so efficient. You've actually answered 2 of the questions in one, because that's my follow-up question about support for astronauts. So thank you so much for that. The next question, I don't have a name, but you know who you are. What's the closest you've come to bringing an astronaut back from space for health reasons, and what did you learn from that experience?
Well, we've had a couple of things that have occurred. We've had thrombosis, for example. Astronauts don't get DVT in the lower extremity because the blood moves north into the thorax and head, but we actually had an astronaut with a thrombus in the internal jugular. And of course, you worry about increased intracranial pressure with that. You worry about pulmonary embolus if that breaks loose. But it just so happened that happened to be one of the things that we had modeled for and that we had seen, and we had flown medication in case that occurred. Now, it had not occurred until then, and I'll be honest with you, we debated whether or not we should take that medication off. We thought, we know the modeling and the Monte Carlo analysis said that we should look for this, but we haven't seen it. It's been over 15 years for the space station. Maybe we had to think about taking that off. And no sooner did we think about that than we had to use that medication. And we debated whether or not to bring that astronaut home, but decided that the re-entry and the rough landing might actually jar that thrombus loose, and that it was better to treat that thrombus, get it smooth, decrease the likelihood of it breaking off or fragmenting, and then treat that astronaut on orbit. And that's what we did. And we were able to follow it by ultrasound, and that did really well. And we've had other things like that that probably, I'd say maybe a dozen cases over the last 5-6 decades where we considered, hey, is this something that we should come home for? But fortunately, each time we had the ability to treat it on orbit, monitor on orbit. That's going to be unique when we go on a Mars mission where it's 20 minutes to get one-way communication, and the things we have to prepare for or plan for are much broader and wider, and the risk is higher if we are not able to treat it to completion. So that's going to be very interesting for exploration missions.
Yeah, and I should add just a couple of things here. You can't just bring one crew member home, right? Because the Soyuz spacecraft brings up 3 people, and that's a lifeboat for the crew on board the space station. So if you're going to bring one person home, you bring 3, right? That's the only opportunity you have to bring them home. The other thing is that drives who you choose and who you select for a Mars mission, right? Like, you've only got 4 people. Are you going to fly a physician? Well, if you're going to do that, then you still got to have a pilot to pilot the spacecraft. You probably need somebody with mechanical skills, unless you can train your physician to become a good mechanic, which is obviously one of the options. But it brings a whole new paradigm in terms of crew selection. So you're not going to be able to bring them home in a matter of hours. It's going to be a matter of sometimes years.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And just picking up on what you mentioned there, just around risk, there's a few comments here in the Q&A around the potential to use Monte Carlo analysis to help plan healthcare services. That was from Amanda Gotch, who's one of our program managers for realistic medicine. The question I'm going to ask is, I don't have a name for this one either. How's your mindset towards risk and management changed from your medical training to your medical NASA work?
Oh, that's a great question. I will tell you that the nice thing about NASA is it's one of the few places where you can marry the 2 philosophies. And in engineering, they're very binary. It's kind of ones and zeros. It's black and white. The one thing I'm envious of is they'll go take a part and they'll stress it and figure out where it breaks. How many foot-pounds before this breaks. And I can't do that to astronauts. They frown on that if I take an astronaut and figure out where they break. But looking at how engineers approach risk has been enlightening, and we've tried to incorporate that a lot on the medical side so that when we are writing standards specifically for a spacecraft, we don't just take care of the astronauts. We actually are involved in writing the standards for the human system integration for a spacecraft. And so we have to speak their language and put and translate medical risk into their language, which is not always easy to do, but it does help. I will tell you, at least for me in the emergency department, I start to view things somewhat. All right, is this a 3x5 risk, a 4x5 risk, or a 5x5 risk, and do we have fault tolerance for, in case this airway fails and things. So you start to see a bleed over of some of the different philosophies, and I think it's pretty helpful. It's think of it like a co-pilot having a checklist. That's not a bad thing, and I think somebody in the chat mentioned Atul Gawande and some of his resources, and that one of his books on checklists and surgery and how that's increased quality, that's very much an engineering type strategy. And so the two have married well together.
Thanks, JD. I'm looking down the list of questions. They seem to be growing as you're answering them, which has to be a good thing, right? The next question I've got is from Laura, and it's actually relating more to sort of culture and organisational framework. If you're part of a team which doesn't feel supportive and is often resistant to change, and management to not create the environment that you've kind of described here today, what would your advice be to start creating a better environment and culture within your team?
Well, I mean, you can talk about it from the medical perspective because it's a different environment than perhaps a safety and engineering perspective. But I think you need to start right at the beginning, right? Your choice of leaders for those types of teams, which are critical teams, is paramount. If you get it wrong, you get into a dysfunctional team where people don't feel listened to, don't feel safe and secure to voice their opinion. It's very difficult to deal with that type of team environment. And I've been in those, right? I think we all have. I think we've all dealt with leaders that really feel that they're doing a good job, but they're really not. There are subtle ways you can do it. I think, getting in people's faces and telling them what you think is probably not the right way to do it, and is probably career limiting in many respects. But I think having a healthy tension, right, which is an expectation from me that people come to me and say, hey, listen, I don't like this. I don't like the way you're running this system. That healthy tension should exist, right? And I think honestly, well, sorry, no pun intended, but honesty is one of the best medicines here. To be honest about one's emotions, one's feelings is actually prevalent in what is traditionally thought of as a very engineering and hard-nosed occupation. But I think honesty goes a long way. JD, from the medical side?
Yeah, I agree. And I think, this goes to management by walking around. If you are a leader or only listening to your subordinates, the supervisors that are reporting to you, no supervisor comes to the boss and says, oh, by the way, my team's dysfunctional and I'm not doing a very good job leading and nobody trusts me. Every supervisor paints a rosy picture for their boss. And the only way to really tell what's really going on is management by walking around and going in and talking to the folks. It's what we call ground truth. And can you get ground truth? Meaning you're going and talking to the troops that are actually doing the job, the folks that are doing the job day in, day out, and asking them, how are things going? And usually you can start to, folks don't want to initially, they're very polite to start with. They don't want to just start laying on all the baggage on the boss when he's doing a walking tour. But you can start to read body language and start to hear a theme as you go if there's a problem in a unit. If they say, well, things are okay, it could be a lot better, there's some issues we're working on. Well, then, tell me more. And you always try to get what I would call 2 levels deep. Very often, if there's an issue, people are hesitant to tell you that issue as a leader in the beginning. And they'll tell you something at the 30,000-foot level. They'll make it vague, they'll make it generic, they'll make it broad, but they won't tell you the real meaty part of that problem. And so, as a leader, that's part of your job, is to, okay, tell me more. Why do you think that? Why aren't things going well? And then when they tell you a little bit more and they get a little bit more specific, then you pull on that next string and think, well, tell me about the process. Tell me about the leadership. Tell me about where do you think that dysfunction is coming from? And then you can actually, get what we call 3 layers deep. You're peeling back the layers of the onion to figure out where the issues are in that organization. But the onus is on you as a leader to actually ask those questions and to manage by walking around and actually talking to the folks that are doing the job, so that you've got good ground truth and good situational awareness for what's going on.
Thanks both. So just talking about that visibility and leadership, And this is something that I've actually spoken to you both about, is just the challenges during the pandemic. And we have a question here from Colin Anderson, and he's actually said, working remotely through via MS Teams, etc., is something that's still very new for most of us here in NHS Scotland. It has presumably been a part of NASA operations from the outset though. Do you have any insights or pearls of wisdom in terms of maintaining effective leadership at a distance?
Well, I think I mentioned a couple during my talk. I think you have to listen for the hidden voices. In other words, the ones that aren't there. If people are being quiet, there's something maybe something amiss there, right? And I think especially in this pandemic environment, where this is in some cases the only way that we have to interact, we have to be even more in tune with those hidden voices, in tune with the people that you know and love, and be certain that you check in with them on a very frequent basis, and much more than you would actually think you should. But also, as I said, in that Teams environment, I always keep the participant list open so I can see who's there, right? I can see who's late in joining. Is that a symptom of something? They know that the meeting's supposed to start at 9 o'clock. Why were they late? 10 minutes late. So checking in with them to say, hey, I noticed you were 10 minutes late this morning. Anything I can help with? And that goes to time management and just basic caring about people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a habit of, and I'm sure it's the same way in Scotland, but in real life meetings, you have time to, take a bathroom break and you have time for other things. What we've noticed is you'll do a meeting from 10 to 11 and the next one starts right at 11. And so giving folks, building in a break for folks where the meeting's not a whole hour, maybe it's only 50 minutes to give folks time to stretch, get up, take a break. And I have also, had to adjust a little bit in that because we don't have a commute, really. I'm not going in and out of the office. I'm not on the train going into Washington, D.C. Very often the workday keeps going. People, they're not hesitating to put a meeting on at 5 and at 6 p.m. and at 7 p.m. And you really just got to put the brakes on that and tell folks, you know what? I know normally we would have stopped by 4:30 or 5 o'clock so folks could commute. We're going to actually stop at 5 o'clock today. We're not doing any meetings after 5 unless there's a spacecraft emergency. And the one thing that the agency does is it tries to leave every other Friday as a catch-up day for folks, not put meetings on that Friday, to allow folks to de-stress a little bit, to catch up on their paperwork, to catch up on their stuff, to do their own thing without back-to-back meetings. And I think that's important as well. The other thing that I've tried to do is to encourage our folks to get exercise and to go out and schedule that as part of their day. And, folks, at least in my office, will think, well, I don't want to take part of the workday to go do that. Actually, the way that Microsoft Teams and all this digital and distance thing is working, I'm getting more than 8 hours of work from everybody. So I'm not worried about somebody taking 45 minutes to go exercise at 9 a.m. I'm pretty sure I'm going to get my pound of flesh and my work from them over the next week. So it doesn't bother me to say, hey, go take care of yourself. I need you to go and you go ride your bike or go hit the gym and do those things. So that's and I think that translates when folks know that you care about them personally. Hey, you got to go take your mom to the hospital or to her appointment or what have you. Go do that. Then if they know that you care about them personally as well, then you typically get a lot better work from those individuals.
I think that's something that's came through consistently, just how much you care about your colleagues, but also their families as well. And at the very heart of NASA's culture is about that sharing learning when things go wrong. Nigel, I just want to bring you back so to a question from Daniel Kleinberg. So one of the bravest things that I have ever seen in my career is actually Nigel standing up to talk about the Space Shuttle Columbia review, because those were his colleagues, but they're actually really good friends, and it just blows my mind, every time I think about it. It was just incredibly brave. The question from Daniel is, how did that impact, when you were doing the report itself and that review? Did it make it easier because they were your friends, or did it make it more difficult for you? I guess it's probably a bit of both.
I would probably put it on, if you look at the scales of justice, I would probably put it on the scale of it was more difficult, right? Because it's easier to talk about metal coming apart, right? Which is what it did, and titanium combusting, which is what it did. Which you don't think about titanium combusting, you think about it melting. But when you think about flesh and bones, right, and nerves and sinews, that's much more difficult to deal with. I think I did myself a disservice though after the report was actually published. I told you I've been around basically the world. Apart from Australasia, which I haven't been down there yet, but to tell the story, and I will tell you that I went on a roadshow, and that was, I decided to do that myself, right? And I was happy to be funded by the agency to do that, but I was at a point where I did not remember which city I was in, and I was on that roadshow. I woke up in the morning and didn't really know which hotel I was, which town I was in. And that actually played into, I would say, both physiological and psychological health challenges to me. But bringing it back to the Columbia itself, I don't think really it's anything brave about doing it. I think that's my job, right? Because my job is to make sure that other people don't make the same mistakes. Just as it would be, a wrong knee surgery or wrong arm surgery. You have to make sure that you tell people, hey, this is what I did, this is what I did wrong, this is what my mental state was going into it. But if you tell the story in a very factual way, that benefits everybody else. And I think honestly that the drawback of all of that was the Challenger in 1986 did not get that same amount of attention. The debris was interned in a silo at Kennedy Space Center, and that debris has never been seen since, apart from twice. Right? That silo has only been opened twice to get to retrieve a couple of pieces of hardware, which I think was a tragedy that we may have been able to help other rocket developers and so.
And just building on that, the Major Challenger, how did you? So this is a question from a couple of our attendees today, Jana and Una. How did you negotiate the challenge of getting agreement to publish the Challenger report with those who were opposed to the publication? That's making you smile.
Well, I think you draw on all of the leadership talents that you've learned over the years, right? Knowing your audience, knowing your people, knowing who the decision maker was, right? And in that particular case, it was the NASA administrator, Mike Griffin, who I already knew very well, who was a highly technical individual. So rather than go to his emotional side of things, you go to his technical side of things and stress that if we don't tell this story, and if it isn't a public document, then people are going to die, right? Because they're not going to learn the lessons that we tragically learned from Columbia. So convincing, I'm not going to tell you who the factions were that really were anti-publishing, but they were a group of folks that were very influential and had a very large voice, even with a NASA administrator. But I think when the final discussion came in his conference room on the 9th floor at NASA headquarters, it was a decision that I think he knew he had to make. So providing him with all the facts and the justification, he was the one that was going to make the decision, and he did.
Yeah, Nigel, I think the other thing that has changed is, but some folks were worried that the families would be upset, that if we published some of this material that we would somehow be injuring the families and it would continue to be an unkind cut to the families. But actually, in talking to the families and in talking to NASA, and especially as commercial spaceflight has taken off and started to emerge, our role of, is morphed more towards teaching. We are trying to teach these other commercial providers what not to do, what to do, why we have the standards we have, and to have them learn our lessons, like Nigel mentioned, so that they don't make the same mistakes. And so it's no longer about keeping our own sins in family, if you will. It's honoring the astronauts that we lost by educating others to make sure that it doesn't follow the same path. And when you put it in those terms, when the families realize that this is not, we're not doing this to be morbid, or we're not doing this to, parade their personal injury that they've had in their family publicly. What we're doing is pointing out the lessons learned to honor the astronauts who sacrificed in order to prevent that accident from occurring, and to make those folks successful. We want Virgin and Blue Origin and SpaceX and Axiom and insert the name of the next company here to all be successful. And that's really changed the paradigm shift, and I think the philosophy for the agency.
Thank you so much. I've got a really nice question here from Simon Edgar, good friends of Realistic Medicine. So Simon asks, listening to Brené Brown and others speaking about creating workplace psychological safety, they describe one of the key components as an acceptance by individuals of their vulnerability. What do you think your astronaut colleagues would say about their own levels of vulnerability?
I was hoping Nigel would go first on that one, but in medicine it's the same way, right? When you have somebody who's willing to strap on to a rocket with several million pounds, these folks are the top of the spear. They have learned, they are right now, at least in our astronaut corps, before we get a lot of commercial public people flying, which will occur. There are folks that are at the top of their career. They are, to coin the phrase, the right stuff, right? But with that comes a little bit of ego. When you have an orthopedic surgeon or a cardiothoracic surgeon who's at the top of their game, you kind of want them to have a little confidence. You don't want to have them to be narcissistic, but you want that person to think, I am the best at what I do, and I do this and I do that. You don't want your cardiothoracic surgeon who's about to do your bypass to be a little sheepish. So I think a little bit of ego comes with that job, but it's changing because it's no longer the elite astronauts that are flying in space, as we've seen in this last month. And right now, if you look at the space patches, there are names on all of them, right? Every time we have a mission, you've got these astronaut names on these patches that go on the wall and live for legacy and history. The one that I think of when at least hearkening back to this question, is probably the most important mission we had, which was Apollo 11 for most of humanity and humankind. And Neil Armstrong insisted that no names be placed on that patch. If you go look up the Apollo 11 patch, it's the only patch that we have that is devoid of astronaut names. And the reason why was because Neil Armstrong said, it's not about me, it's not about the United States, it's about humanity and humanity moving beyond Earth. And so, having that mindset, I think, is important, especially as we get to commercial. We eventually want people to fly in space, much like they do getting on United Airlines or British Air. And so you'll know when we succeed when there's no longer names again on those patches. When I doubt that when Nigel and I get to fly in space, nobody's embroidering our name on anything. But that's a good thing. That means that we've evolved it and made spaceflight safe enough that it's much more common for the lay person to go fly.
Yeah, let me add I used to, when I was 17, 18, 19, I used to, when my father had emergency surgeries at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, I used to drive him up to King's College Hospital, right, in London. It was an hour drive, but it allowed him to sleep a little bit more. And I used to go in the theater and watch, and I observed. And obviously, I never said anything, right? That wasn't my place to be there to say anything. I wasn't a medical person. But what I did observe, though, and it was interesting just to observe as a young man, was exactly what JD mentioned, right? This is 1970s, right? So the surgeon was the leader of that group, and it was much more about the ego at that time, I would say. I think in today's theater operation, I think it's much more, and I haven't been in one recently, but I've observed things. It's much more of a combined team effort, right? And it's nothing. It's no more of that hail the leader type scenario. It's more of the scrub nurse is as important as the surgeon doing the bypass, right? And the anesthesiologist or anesthetist is a vital part of a team, as is the recovery nurse, as is the prep nurse. So this whole team, as JD mentioned earlier, I think is much more the whole team getting to play a part in this entire ordeal. I think is the most important.
Thanks so much. So you'll be glad to know I have one final question, and you'll be even gladder to know that I have managed to find a bigger fan of NASA than Gregor Smith, and I never thought that would happen because he's a huge NASA fan. But the final question goes to Greg Chalmers, and he's taken us from leadership back to space. So he has described himself as a self-confessed space anorak. And his question is, do you think the low orbit returnable space shuttle program will be viewed in future as a deviation with the present planned missions, picking up where Apollo left off? Or is there a natural line of evolution across the years that isn't obvious to the uneducated observer? It's a nice, easy one to finish on.
So let me start this one, and then I'll let JD think about how he's going to respond. When the shuttle, let's go back to Apollo, right? And in the early 70s when that program ended, it was going to be 15 years or so until the space shuttle actually started flying. And at the same time, we were talking about Mars, right? So even back in the 70s, I would actually say back in the 60s, but certainly in the 70s, we were talking about Mars as a destination. And that common theme has run through the 80s, through the 90s, through the 2000s. And it is now actually becoming much more real. I think we're really thinking about putting a date on this thing, right? It almost always seemed to be 10 years away or 20 years away. I think now, though, the corners turn. The ending of the space shuttle program, I think, for people that weren't around for Challenger and weren't around for the end of the Apollo program, I think was a big deal. I think and the gap of almost a decade before we started flying people back off of U.S. soil again was difficult for a lot of people to handle. But I think the fact that the International Space Station bridged the gap, right? It helped congeal the space operations from the middle of the space shuttle program, which we couldn't have built the space station without the space shuttle, all the way through to today, right? And you might want to remind anyone that's less than 20 years old that there hasn't been a day in their entire life that there hasn't been somebody floating around up there on the space station, doing important science and research. So It's a great question, because it's one that we should have perhaps over a coffee at a pub, because it's more historical and much more thought-provoking than just factual. Let me put it that way. JD?
Yeah, I think everything builds upon each other. We learned a lot in the Space Shuttle program. We learned a lot about material science, new materials for re-entry with the different ceramics and other things that we used for the tiles for re-entry. We learned about processing of a spacecraft and how to rapidly turn it around to get it ready for the next mission. That applies to SpaceX right now. And SpaceX uses some of those same processes that we invented for the shuttle program. So I don't know that you can say that any endeavor that large, and of course the Space Shuttle was probably the most sophisticated engineering machine built at that time, that anything is a deviation necessarily. I think they all build upon each other. We learned a lot about vehicles. We learned a lot about designs. What designs would we want to emulate for interplanetary missions? Are there different things that we could take from the Space Shuttle program? I think when we go forward to Mars, it'll be an amalgamation of not just NASA's different vehicles, but also lessons learned from SpaceX, from Blue, from all these other vendors as well. SpaceX does things differently than we do. We do some things better than they do. They do some things more efficiently than we do as a private enterprise. But we've learned from each other, and I think it all builds upon each other. If you hearken back to the early aviation days, I think it's the same way. When there was only one builder of an airplane, there was one way to do it. But then when you suddenly got 10 different people building airplanes and innovation, they build upon each other. And you see lots of innovation. The more people that are in the game building spacecraft, I think we'll find more innovation. So I don't think deviation is the word I would use. I would think it was a baseline and perhaps a building block that is maybe just one block of many that will help educate future spacecraft and future missions.
JD, Nigel, that has been amazing. Thank you so much. You've taken us a whirlwind tour of leadership and space and everything in between. I'm going to finish the questions there, and I'll now hand back to Gregor, who's just going to say some final thank yous. But from me, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer. Wow. So those of you hearing JD and Nigel for the first time will now begin to understand why I hold them in such high regard and why I'm just so grateful to know them. Honest, open, humble, exceptional people first and foremost. Those personal reflections were at times very poignant to hear. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing them in the way that you did. Let me tell you that I really like the thought of not scheduling meetings after 5 o'clock as well. That would be fantastic. And catch-up days, that sounds like an absolute bonus that we should be starting this week. And I couldn't agree more about taking time to be physically active. We need to be kinder to ourselves and to the people that we work with, and making sure that we remain active. This is really important. So thank you. Thank you to both JD and Nigel for their insightful wisdom, their openness, their generosity in sharing their learning. 2 quotes from Travellers in Space I want to leave you with after today's session. First is from Ron Garan, a US astronaut, and he said, "Earth is a small town with many neighbourhoods in a very big universe." It's important that we hold on to this thought, as it's never been so apparent that our futures are interdependent, whatever neighbourhood of the world you currently live in. And secondly, the very famous British space traveller known only as Doctor Who said, 900 years of time in space, and I've never met anyone who wasn't important. I hope you've all enjoyed today's session. We'll be emailing you shortly with a short evaluation survey and your certificate of attendance. A huge thank you to David Bath from NHS Grampian for his technical support for the session, and to Jennifer and the rest of the Realistic Medicine team, as always, who've been working away in the background to bring this session to you. Remember to join us over on Twitter to access resources from today's session and stay part of the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you again soon. Bye for now.
Gregor, thank you as well. We really appreciate it.